Chapter 11: Corporate Warfare and Blood Spice. Black pepper is an entirely innocent botanical specimen. The creeping vine, known to science as Piper nigrum, is native to the monsoon-drenched forests of the Western Ghats along India's Malabar coast. The plant demands stifling tropical heat, torrential rainfall, and the dappled shade of a dense jungle canopy to produce its pungent, wrinkled berries. It is a simple agricultural product that has never inherently demanded a single drop of human blood. Men, however, demanded the spice, and they were more than willing to slaughter entire populations to secure its supply. In the 17th century, the pursuit of this singular commodity birthed a terrifying new mechanism of human organization. This mechanism was the multinational joint stock company, an entity designed to pool risk and institutionalize greed on a global scale. Before the year 1600, European trade with the pepper ports of Asia was largely the domain of royal monopolies and crown-sponsored explorers. The Portuguese had brutally dominated the Indian Ocean spice routes throughout the 16th century, treating the vast maritime region as a closed, heavily militarized zone. But as the new century dawned, ambitious merchants in London and Amsterdam realized that the vast capital required to sail around the Cape of Good Hope could not be sustained indefinitely by individual royal treasuries. They needed to sell shares to the public, separate their financial liability from their physical operations, and deploy capital with ruthless efficiency. They required a legal framework that would allow them to act not just as traders, but as absolute rulers. Thus began the era of the sovereign corporations, entities that would permanently rewire the global economy through the relentless application of supply chain violence. The genesis of the corporate leviathan. On the damp, freezing New Year's Eve of 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted an unprecedented royal charter to a syndicate of 215 wealthy London merchants. This defining document officially created the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies, which would later become universally feared as the British East India Company, or EIC. The Royal Charter granted these merchants a strict 15-year monopoly on all English trade occurring east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. Initially, the EIC was a precarious and highly volatile venture, financing single, disjointed voyages and struggling to establish a permanent foothold in the chaotic Asian pepper markets. The Dutch response to the English initiative was far more aggressive, far more organized, and infinitely more devastating to the indigenous populations of Asia. Between 1595 and 1602, early Dutch expeditions to the East Indies had sparked a chaotic frenzy of competing trading firms known as the Voorcompagnieën. This ruinous domestic competition succeeded only in driving up the purchase price of black pepper in the archipelago, while simultaneously crashing its sale price on the European markets. To halt this financial self-destruction, the visionary Dutch statesman Johan van Oldenbarnevelt forced the competing merchants to amalgamate their operations into a single, unified entity. On March 20, 1602, the States General of the Netherlands issued a monumental charter establishing the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, widely known as the VOC. The enterprise was inaugurated with a massive founding capital of 6.5 million Dutch guilders and was granted a 21-year monopoly on all Asian trade. These foundational corporate documents were not mere business licenses or administrative formalities. They were unprecedented legal frameworks that granted the VOC and the EIC the right to function under a sovereign charter, a state-sponsored license to kill. As detailed by legal historians, these companies were designed from their very inception to operate as hybrid corporate states. Minting coin and drafting law. The true measure of a state is its ability to project lethal authority and perfectly control the flow of its capital. The VOC and EIC charters explicitly authorize these private corporations to build massive stone fortresses, raise standing armies, appoint regional governors, and dispense both civil and criminal justice. Furthermore, they were granted the breathtaking right to mint their own money, striking a coin as the ultimate historical declaration of sovereignty, and these corporate leviathans stamped their respective logos onto the currencies that flowed through the pepper ports of the Indian Ocean. These megacorporations were essentially private governments funded by eager public shareholders, accountable only to their corporate boards rather than any voting citizenry. The VOC was governed by a central board of 17 directors, famously known as the Heren the 17, who sat in wood-panelled boardrooms in Amsterdam and dictated the fate of millions from halfway across the globe. They drafted their own draconian laws to govern their remote outposts and fiercely regulated the daily lives of their thousands of employees. Company servants were strictly forbidden from engaging in private trade, an absolute injunction meant to ensure that every ounce of extracted spice wealth flowed directly back into the VOC's central coffers. The British EIC, governed by its Court of Directors in London, eventually acquired identical sovereign powers. In a series of acts passed around 1670, King Charles II explicitly granted the EIC the autonomous right to acquire foreign territory, command regular troops, form military alliances, and make war and peace independently of Parliament. These corporations were fully authorized to negotiate binding treaties with Asian monarchs in the name of their home republics, though these treaties were frequently signed under the looming threat of naval artillery. They were sovereign entities in every practical sense, possessing all the lethal and bureaucratic capabilities of a centralized European nation-state. The Anglo-Dutch Spice Wars. When the VOC and the EIC arrived in the Indian Ocean, they were immediately thrust into a highly volatile and heavily fortified geopolitical landscape. They faced entrenched Islamic maritime trading networks, fading but heavily armed Portuguese fortresses, and powerful indigenous kingdoms that had successfully managed the global pepper trade for centuries. The European corporate directors quickly recognized that free and open trade was mathematically catastrophic for their desired profit margins. To guarantee the astronomical financial returns demanded by their shareholders, they had to systematically eliminate all regional competition. This desperate capital-driven drive for absolute monopoly ignited a relentless mercantile proxy war, a corporate battlefield that stretched violently across two oceans. The Anglo-Dutch Spice Wars were not fought by traditional national armies, but by heavily armed corporate fleets flying distinct company flags. The VOC and the EIC engaged in bloody, multi-decade clashes, sinking each other's merchant ships, blockading vital economic straits, and financing rival local kings to destabilize their enemies. The primary objectives of this corporate warfare were the specific, highly lucrative pepper and spice ports scattered across the Malabar coast of India and the vast Indonesian archipelago. The conflict was brutal, geographically expansive, and incredibly expensive to maintain. The VOC understood from its inception that to control the global supply of black pepper, they had to physically seize the sources of agricultural production by force. As historians outline, the Dutch rapidly transformed from opportunistic merchants into heavily armed conquerors, leveraging their superior naval technology to systematically dismantle the aging Portuguese Empire in Asia. The British EIC, initially lacking the vast consolidated capital reserves of the Dutch, were forced into a desperate, bloody struggle for simple survival on the fringes of the Spice Archipelago. Divergent strategies of corporate conquest. As the proxy wars continually escalated throughout the 17th century, a stark divergence in the operational strategies of the two corporate leviathans began to emerge. The Dutch possessed the immense financial might to wage total, unyielding war, while the English initially had to rely heavily on guile, diplomacy, and subversion. This strategic schism defined the early colonial era and dictated the physical flow of black pepper into Europe. The Dutch VOC strategy. The VOC deployed an aggressively militarized, heavily fortified colonial strategy designed to secure absolute market dominance. They prioritized the total monopolization of goods through the ruthless use of military violence against both native populations and European rivals. They constructed massive, imposing stone fortresses, deployed thousands of standing corporate soldiers, and forced local rulers into exclusive protection treaties that legally forbade them from selling spices to anyone but the Dutch. This militarized approach allowed them to completely dominate the fine spice trade, but it ultimately saddled the corporation with staggering, unsustainable administrative and military overhead costs. The British EIC strategy. In stark contrast, the EIC initially relied on a highly flexible, more diplomatic, factory-based trading strategy. Unable to match the sheer military firepower and naval tonnage of the VOC, the English focused on negotiating complex treaties, bribing local port officials, and establishing unfortified trading posts, known historically as factories, in neutral or friendly ports. The EIC actively partnered with Asian intermediaries, adapted to local cultural practices, and importantly, liberalized their internal trade by allowing company servants to conduct private business alongside their official duties. This flexibility ultimately allowed the British to strategically pivot toward highly profitable Indian textiles when the heavily armed Dutch locked them out of the Indonesian spice markets. Monopolizing the ports, the Malabar coast of southwestern India was the undisputed historical epicenter of global black pepper production. The VOC recognised early on that displacing the entrenched Portuguese from this vital coastline was absolutely paramount to monopolising the spice. Their corporate strategy hinged on forming aggressive military alliances with local Indian polities, most notably the Zamarin of Calicut, who had long chafed under Portuguese maritime supremacy. The Dutch approach to subjugating the Malabar ports was breathtakingly violent and systematically thorough. The VOC Admiral Rycloff van Goens orchestrated a highly aggressive militaristic policy, arguing repeatedly that the astronomical costs of raising a corporate army would be rapidly offset by the absolute control of the pepper supplied. In 1658, the VOC launched a massive amphibious assault to capture the vital Portuguese fort at Quilon, a critical node in the regional pepper network. After a brief operational loss, Van Goens returned in December 1661 with a massive naval fleet to recapture the port, unleashing devastating artillery barrages against the coastal defences. Upon successfully securing Quilon, the VOC executed a calculated policy of total urban destruction. To consolidate their newly acquired power and create a highly defensible perimeter, the Dutch ordered the ancient city to be razed almost entirely to the ground. Corporate soldiers methodically demolished local houses, civic buildings, and 7 massive stone churches left behind by the Portuguese and the Franciscans. The Queen of Quilon, who had fiercely and bravely resisted the corporate invasion, was finally coerced into signing a humiliating peace treaty that granted the VOC exclusive trade rights and full legal jurisdiction over the new fortress. The archipelago battleground. While the Malabar coast burned under artillery fire, an equally savage corporate war raged across the vast Indonesian archipelago. The massive islands of Java and Sumatra were historic producers of black pepper, and the VOC was determined to control the output of every single vine. They established their very first permanent outpost at Banten in western Java in 1603, using it as a fortified staging ground to constantly project naval power throughout the Java and Banda seas. The Dutch utilized a relentless strategy of legal extortion to completely dominate the Sumatran pepper ports of Jambi and Palembang. They systematically forced local sultans into exclusive purchasing agreements, promising dubious military protection in exchange for drastically below-market fixed prices on their pepper yields. When desperate Chinese or English merchants attempted to circumvent these predatory contracts by offering fair market value for the spices, the VOC immediately deployed heavily armed gunboats to ruthlessly enforce their monopoly. Local rulers who bravely resisted these corporate contracts were routinely overthrown, kidnapped or exiled to Batavia by VOC mercenaries. The British EIC desperately attempted to maintain a commercial foothold in the archipelago, but they were systematically hunted down by the superior Dutch fleets. This bitter corporate rivalry reached a bloody, horrifying crescendo in 1623 with the infamous Amboina massacre. On the island of Ambon, VOC officials arbitrarily arrested, brutally tortured, and formally executed a group of EIC servants on highly dubious charges of treason. This calculated act of judicial terror was specifically designed to completely squeeze the English out of the lucrative Eastern Spice Islands, eventually forcing the EIC to retreat toward the Indian subcontinent. Extirpation and artificial scarcity. The VOC's terrifying commitment to absolute market dominance birthed the unprecedented corporate policy of extirpation. Black pepper and other fine spices were highly geographically dispersed, making a true airtight monopoly nearly impossible to maintain without constant, exhausting military intervention. When the Dutch directors realized they could not physically control every single pepper vine or clove tree in the vast Indonesian archipelago, they chose to simply annihilate the excess agricultural supply. Corporate soldiers were regularly dispatched on brutal military sweeps to systematically destroy spice crops in any regions that fell outside of direct company control. By ruthlessly cutting down thousands of mature fruit-bearing trees and setting fire to countless productive pepper vines, the VOC deliberately and artificially engineered global scarcity. This aggressive, systemic destruction of agricultural wealth ensured that the prices of pepper, cloves, and nutmeg remained artificially inflated on the European commodity markets. This scorched earth policy represented a profound and terrifying perversion of traditional trade. The VOC was actively destroying physical value in the real world to fiercely protect the abstract financial value of their shares in Amsterdam. The deliberate starvation, economic ruin, and impoverishment of indigenous communities were casually written off by corporate accountants as necessary operational expenses. The corporate ledger was continuously balanced through the relentless application of supply chain violence, ensuring that the wealthy European consumer never had to consider the smoke and blood rising from the Malabar coast. The human cost, blood in the ledger. The sterile academic term corporate monopoly completely fails to capture the visceral, waking horror inflicted upon the indigenous populations of Asia. The VOC and the EIC did not just passively trade goods, they engineered massive systems of absolute physical subjugation to ensure their massive merchant ships returned to Europe fully laden. To guarantee profitability for their shareholders, they implemented draconian production quotas, blood in the ledger. These agricultural quotas were not mere corporate targets, they were literal death sentences for any community that failed to meet them. The VOC inherently recognized that natural market forces of supply and demand would never yield the astronomical profit margins desired by the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Therefore, they systematically and violently destroyed local economies to transform once independent farmers into indentured corporate subjects. The Dutch deliberately dismantled the ancient, pre-existing inter-island trade networks that had peacefully moved vital foodstuffs and spices between Java, Sumatra, and the Moluccas for centuries. By maliciously severing these maritime lifelines, they forced local populations into total, inescapable dependency on the VOC for basic survival. In 1619, the ruthlessly efficient VOC Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Cohen codified this systemic exploitation across the island of Java. Cohen implemented a brutal cultivation system that legally required Javanese farmers to dedicate a massive 20% of their fertile agricultural land exclusively to the cultivation of black pepper for the company. To ensure that not a single peppercorn leaked into the free market, Cohen formally decreed that selling the spice to any non-vogue trader was a severe crime punishable by immediate execution. The corporate agricultural mandate had officially and legally become a machine for mass murder. The architecture of genocide. While black pepper was the primary volume driver of the global spice trade, the VOC's uncompromising approach to monopoly reached its most horrific apex in the pursuit of nutmeg and mace. The Banda Islands, a tiny volcanic archipelago in the Banda Sea, were the world's only known source of these highly precious commodities. The VOC had initially forced the Bandanese village chiefs known as the Orankayas to sign strict contracts demanding they hand over their entire harvest exclusively to the Dutch at fixed, abysmal prices. The Bandanese, facing literal starvation due to the VOC's intentional blockade of essential food imports from Java, continually defied the corporate monopoly by secretly trading with English and Asian merchants. In 1621, Governor-General Cohen coldly decided that enforcing the legal contract was too expensive and that the only permanent operational solution was the total eradication of the indigenous population. He deployed a massive mercenary fleet to the islands, initiating a systematic campaign of terror that modern scholars explicitly and accurately categorize as an act of genocide. The corporate violence was total, unforgiving, and apocalyptic. Cohen's militarized forces systematically hunted down the Bandanese across the mountainous islands, burning their ancient villages and publicly executing their civic leaders. Before the Dutch arrival, the islands possessed a thriving, culturally rich population of approximately 15,000 people. After Cohen's militarized subjugation, only about 1,000 traumatized survivors remained alive. The VOC then seamlessly imported thousands of enslaved people from across Asia to repopulate the islands and work the nutmeg groves, ensuring the corporate production quotas were maintained without further native resistance. The abstraction of violence. The ultimate triumph for the VOC and the EIC was the brilliant, terrifying invention of pure financial abstraction. These megacorporations pioneered complex legal and financial structures that perfectly insulated their wealthy European investors from the horrific, bloody violence being perpetrated in their names across the globe. Shares of the VOC could be freely bought and sold by ordinary citizens in the open-air secondary markets of Amsterdam, completely divorcing the generation of corporate wealth from the physical reality of its violent extraction. To secure their massive operations, the VOC implemented sophisticated financial instruments, such as the famous 1613 insurance contract, initiated to protect the company's Ninth Fleet. The directors drafted a policy with a nominal value of 3.2 million guilders, sold to current shareholders for a 5% premium, seamlessly hedging the physical risks of maritime warfare through paper contracts. The dividends paid out to these distant, insulated shareholders were historically staggering. By 1650, the accumulated payouts and massive capital gains of the VOC returned 13 times an investor's original capital, representing a massive average total return of 27%. Some historical accounts indicate the VOC maintained an unprecedented average annual dividend of 18% for nearly 2 centuries, solidifying its status as the most profitable enterprise in global history. These immense, continuous profits directly fueled the Dutch Golden Age, building the grand, elegant canal houses of Amsterdam and funding the priceless masterpieces of the era's great painters. However, every single guilder and shilling paid out on the European stock exchanges was directly subsidized by the militarized subjugation of Asian populations. The staggering wealth of the corporate state was built directly upon the ashes of Quilon, the genocide of Banda, and the forced, brutalized labor of the Javanese pepper farmers. The fall of the Leviathans. Despite their unprecedented power, the sovereign corporations eventually began to collapse under the crushing financial weight of their own militarized greed. By the early 18th century, the VOC was slowly suffocating under the colossal administrative overhead required to permanently garrison its vast network of fortresses across Asia. The ruthless, decades-long suppression of local economies eventually strangled the very maritime trade networks the company relied upon, while rampant corruption among underpaid company servants hollowed out the corporate treasury from within. The financial health of the competing corporations was directly tied to their ability to navigate European politics and Asian warfare. While the VOC enjoyed massive shipping tonnages that peaked at 280,035 tons between 1731 and 1740, the EIC struggled early on with regulatory instability from the English monarchy. In the 1690s, English political extractions caused the EIC's share price to crash spectacularly, falling to a mere 11% of the robust Dutch share price by 1697. However, as the 18th century progressed, the tides of corporate warfare began to permanently shift. As the Dutch faltered, staggering under the costs of their heavily fortified strategy, the British East India Company ruthlessly filled the geopolitical void. The EIC, having successfully pivoted to the massive textile and tea wealth of the Indian subcontinent, eventually abandoned its peaceful factory strategy and fully embraced the violent mechanics of territorial conquest. Following the devastating Fourth Anglo-Dutch War between 1780 and 1784, the VOC was absolutely wrecked, leading to its humiliating liquidation and nationalization in 1799. The victorious EIC subsequently raised massive private presidency armies that eventually swelled to over 260,000 native soldiers, a highly lethal force twice the size of the official British Standing Army. They officially ceased to be a mere trading company and became a rapacious, expansionist empire in their own right, dominating India until they too were nationalized, following the bloody uprisings of 1857. The legacy of the black pepper trade is not a romantic, swashbuckling tale of daring maritime exploration or brave nautical discovery. It is the definitive, terrifying blueprint for modern corporate exploitation and systemic supply chain violence. The VOC and the EIC conclusively proved that a corporation, when granted the sovereign powers of a state, will inevitably utilize total, unyielding warfare to protect its profit margins and please its distant shareholders. They demonstrated that capital, when entirely divorced from human morality and armed with naval artillery, possesses an infinite capacity for destruction. The blood spilled over the pepper vine permanently rewired the global economy, leaving deep, unhealed scars across India and Indonesia that remain entirely visible to this day.